I would like to welcome you to the Lexington Remembers series sponsored by the Friends of the Council on Aging. And we are very pleased today to have Guy Doran and his son Sam Doran, who will be talking to us about the history of their family and of Doran Farms. As you know, our last series, we're looking at Lexington as a farming community. So we welcome you to this series and this program. I guess we'll start with you, Sam, and you're going to tell us about the early Doran family coming to America.
Yes.
Okay.
The Dorans had their roots in Ireland, but at one point around the 1700s we moved over to Scotland and then to the Isle of Man, which is a small island in the Irish Sea. And in 1836 we were still living in Ballinair, Isle of Man, which is right near the most famous castle in the area. But at one point William Doran, son of Edward and Mary Little, moved over to Dublin around 1838, and he married Eleanor O'Connor. And just 1 year or so after he married her, he moved again, this time to Boston. And it was in 1843 that him and Eleanor had their first son, Alfred, or Uncle Alf to all of us. And they then moved to Brookline. Shortly after that, around 1845, when they had their second son, Levi, who was my great-great-grandfather and my father's great-grandfather. And Levi, Alfred, and then there were also several other siblings, many of whom died as infants, but there was also Uncle Enoch, Aunt Emily, and Aunt Susie. And Alf, Levi, and Enoch, around the 1850s, started up, or 1860s, excuse me, started up a grocery business in Brookline, in the Lyceum Hall building. I have a picture of that here. And I have an old ad here as well. Dealers in choice family groceries, the Doran brothers. They sold butter, cheese, lard, eggs, teas, coffee, spices, and then fruit and vegetables, which were grown on their own farm that they had with the father, William, on Acres Avenue in Brookline. And that farm continued on long after Levi had left Brookline for Lexington. And in 1893, the grocery business had closed, and Levi left the family farm in Brookline for the old Spalding house on East Street, across from where our greenhouses were until recently. And the house is still standing at number 151. And so 1 year later, in 1894, Levi bought the old farm with a barn, 2 sheds, a windmill, and he had 1 cow and 3 horses in the beginning. Originally, Levi would sell plants, perhaps only pepper plants, and tomatoes or lettuce to anyone who came by and wanted them. He didn't really go to the market and actively sell in that way. He did his retail selling across the street where the greenhouses were until recently. But on the other side, there was the bulk of the farmland. This is Levi Doran with his dog there. That portrait was actually in the portrait show in Buckman Tavern on the 2nd floor just this past year. This is my great-great-aunt Lena, or Eleanor, but she was referred to as Lena, was quite a photographer, and we were fortunate enough to have several albums of her photographs. This is East Street, a nice winter scene back around 1900 to 1910.
These are treasures.
Yeah. The farm that they bought in 1894, though, was the Joseph Spalding farm and house that he had built 10 years before in 1884. And he had torn down an old house to do that. That was the old Locke house. And Mr. Locke, after living there and selling to Spalding, moved up onto what is now Burroughs Road, but was then the extension of Ridge Road, just an old dirt cart path. And this was a little old house. I think my father will talk about that. Right here is the Doran house as it appeared maybe 5 or 10 years after they bought it. And that there is Ned Doran, my great-grandfather, watering the cow by his barn. Ned and his 3 sisters were all born in Brookline, or 2 sisters, Molly and Lena. And they all moved out to Lexington in 1893, but only partially. Levi and Ned remained in Brookline for a few years because Ned was still in the high school there, and Levi had a nice steady job as manager of a grocery business. However, after a few years, they came out and joined the 2 sisters and the mother on East Street. This is Ned Doran plowing the north field, which is about where the greenhouses were up until recently. And there's Levi with his afternoon nap on a Sunday afternoon. Aunt Lena, sort of a Annie Oakley type photograph, I guess.
True.
Yeah. Also, Levi grew quite a lot of sweet peas. We did have hired hands in the beginning. In 1900, the federal census shows an Albert McDonald born in Maine and a John Lamontagne born in Canada, who were both hired hands living in the house. In 1910, however, we didn't have hired hands anymore. However, we did have Italian women who would come out to perhaps pick celery or lettuce during the day, and they would come out from where? Cambridge or Boston?
Boston, yeah.
And ride the trolley out. So in 1907, my great-grandfather Ned married Bertha Dunlop Downs, who was born in Prince Edward Island, and had come to America with her whole family maybe 10, 15 years before that. Together, they had 3 children. The first 2 are pictured here. My grandfather, Bob, or Robert Edward, and my great-uncle, David John. They're fishing there on the bridge over East Street, over Vine Brook on East Street. The bridge doesn't look quite like that anymore, but they're pictured here with Arnold Fisk, who was a neighbor from just down the street. His family had lived, well, they were the first family on East Street back in 1678, but...
Fisk School? Fisk School?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the pest house,
Yes.
the hospital.
Yeah.
All right.
Speaking of school, that's our early school bus with my grandfather getting on.
That's wonderful.
Well, that's another picture of that.
Yeah. That's,
On a hot day.
yeah, on Vine Brook.
Vine Brook.
My father described Vine Brook as a real brook. I mean, there were mink and fish, and there was trapping done along Vine Brook and fishing.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. That's before it was actually dredged and widened.
Yeah, it was widened in the 30s, I think, and
Yes.
and that's also when it was culverted, all
Right.
since
Culverted,
Hayes Lane, yeah.
This is just a cute picture.
Yeah, that actually, Aunt Lena, my great family photographer, sent that into the newspaper. I think it was a Boston paper, and it won a photo contest, and she got $2 or $5 as the prize. So that's Levi with Bob and Dave.
And he gave him rides
Yeah.
with 2 ice picks going across the field.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
You don't know what field that is, do you?
It was the field right behind the house and the
Oh, yeah.
greenhouses, where the condominiums are.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Now, in the center of this picture, we have an introduction to the family. In the center is my third, the third of the brothers, my second great uncle, Richard Jordan Doran. So my dad will talk about the 3 boys growing up. However, I will add that they did actually sell Bob and Dave as children when they were still in school, would sell plants from the hotbeds. And let's see, they would actually, Bob and Dave were taken on walks by their aunts Molly and Lena, and then a neighbor from up on Merriam Hill, Annie Muzzy, who lived in the old Muzzy homestead. And all of them would go and walk around the surrounding woodlands, particularly to Shaker Glen in Woburn, or sort of on the Lexington line. And it was through these walks, Lena and Molly were great fans of horticulture and botany. And right here is actually a book that they bought the year they came to Lexington, How to Know the Wildflowers. They were particularly fond of wildflowers. And they would take my grandfather and his brother Dave on these walks. And it was through the walks that they were sort of the childhood inspiration that caused Bob and Dave to become so interested in horticulture and botany when they grew up. So,
Now, which one was the teacher at Brookline and St. Johnsbury Academy?
yeah. Aunt Lena taught at Lexington High, then Haverhill High School, and then she went up to St. Johnsbury, Vermont to teach at the academy there. And Aunt Molly became a social worker and lived in Philadelphia for a short time. Now, in around between 1932 and 1938, the Great Depression had hit the family rather hard, and we lost one side of the street to the bank, the savings bank, the side that had the house and barn and the main farmland. So the whole family moved to a house at the site of what was recently DeSalles in Lexington Center. And the house was later moved back to Vinebrook Road, where it still is today. And then they moved to Sheridan Street off of Grant, and then back to East Street, and they rented the house that my family lives in now. So, but because they lost the side of the street that had two greenhouses as well that had been built on that side, they only had the side that we live on today. And later on, that was where the retail had originally been done. But they did later build greenhouses on that side. The first one was in 1935, and then kept building greenhouses until, how many were there in 2006?
Well, the first one, if it was 1935, and it was very small, and then it was added on to, but it was still the smallest one that we had. Mm-hmm. And obviously it was called number one.
Yes.
And my grandfather basically, when they were renting houses, but he came back, and because we had that side of the street, it wasn't in his name like the farm was. It was in his sister's name. And she said, just use it and continue to farm. So he basically made a living growing field pansies and hardy ivy and primroses. And he worked out of this little greenhouse, and of course the field pansies were grown outside and wintered over outside. The ivy he grew in the greenhouse. He had stock plants outside, but he would root cuttings and grow them inside during the winter. And the primroses were grown outside in lath frames. And in the springtime, all the women on Merriam Hill would come down and dig he would dig the pansies for them, and he also wholesaled them to other places. So that's what he did until my father, who, when the farm changed during the Depression, my father was a young man, and in order to make a living and go forward and eventually meet my mother and begin a family, he worked at Breck's Nursery. He worked for Frazier's down in Wellesley, I think. He worked for Johnny Cummings in Burlington, which was a big place as well as other jobs. I mean, during the war, he worked for Hood Milk, he worked for General Radio, and he had part-time jobs watering window boxes out on the ledge of, I think it was Filene's at Jordan Marsh in Boston. One of them had big window boxes, and he'd go in at night and take care of those as a second job. But when he finally made a decision to come back and begin building greenhouses in the 40s, basically the late 40s, he would work at night and weekends putting up these secondhand greenhouses that he had purchased from other places. And my mother would help him. And he put up part of number 2, about 50 feet, 50 by 25. And then he put up number 3, which was about 35 by 100. And then he built the second half of number 2. Then he had a sash house made out of hotbed sash that you'd actually stand them up to make the sides and then have others for the roof. Then he built number 5, and then a lean-to connecting 2 and 3. So gradually he was building this, and by the early 50s, when he took the corner of the property and built a house for our family, myself and my 2 brothers would work part-time, as kids. And it just continued to go along on that, at that rate, really, but never stopped until we were still building greenhouses when he died in 1984, and we actually, my wife and I, tore down some of the original ones and put up newer plastic ones, plastic hoop houses. But we continued to go forward, really, from the day he made the decision to come back and work with his father and then start building greenhouses. So
Determination.
it's been a lot of fun. It really has. The whole process and being part of several generations doing business, living in Lexington and doing business in Lexington, and being on East Street. I don't know whether, I think I'd shown you this
Yes,
once
that's it,
before,
yes.
but it gives you a real indication as to what it was like. And to me, it was one of the really prime parts of Lexington because it was flat for the
Yes.
most part. It had great soil. Other parts of town had good soil, but different kinds of soil, like Waltham Street had a heavy bottomland soil. And this was really loam and topsoil. Some of it a little sandier than other parts, but it was one of the prime growing areas, market garden areas in Lexington. And I've always felt very fortunate to have seen this. I was born in '48, and by the time we built, my father built a house in '52, and we moved there. I was only 4, but for several years, I experienced this, and all these farms that you see here, and this picture was taken in '48, I believe, those farms were all there back to the turn of the century or earlier, so that it was still part of that earlier generation that was still there in the early '50s, and basically active, still farmed up until around 1960, and then they began to close down, either through somebody dying or just selling off, really. Actually, 3 of them died, so right around 1960, so that was sort of the end of that era.
In this
As
whole
far as
neighborhood,
the actual
yes.
farming, yeah.
Now, where are you on this? Just point
Just-
this out so that we can show.
Okay, this is East Street, starting at Adams.
Okay.
And going up the street, well, if you swung around, you had Chies's. And up here on Adams Street, you had Chester Lidberg, had cows. And then as you go up East Street, you had Porter Wilson. And actually, this was done in,
58.
no,
No.
this picture was just prior to Fisk School opening, because it was
Okay.
still under construction in the field. But that land was from the Porter Wilson farm. That was
Right.
part of it. So Porter Wilson, and then you went in, and Baskin, which is part of the Porter Wilson clan. And then you had a very big farm here that belonged to Burnham's.
All right.
And you didn't catch Lois Smith Burnham.
No.
We've got some good pictures and give you a little background on them.
Okay.
Oscar Kenrick, that came from the Kenrick family in Belmont, and they were an old-time market gardening family, and they were big in Belmont, but he came over here and bought the Peters farm, or the Peters property, and he was an interesting person himself, and very, he never married, but if the family, if he had, and the family had carried on, he was headed in the direction of being quite a retail garden establishment. When he first came, he was a market gardener, but then he gradually got into annuals and shrubs, and he really was headed in the right direction. But he had no family, so to speak, behind him. So, of course, Bowser's, Paul Bowser's farm, which was originally
It was Francis Hayes and Colonel Towers. They made the racetrack there.
Right.
And then it passed to the O'Neill brothers and then to Bowser.
And Bowser, really, the entrance to the O'Neill racetrack, when O'Neill owned it, was that lane that's across the street from where our store was.
Yes.
That goes down, and it divided the Doran farm and the Bailey farm. But that was the entrance to the O'Neill area. And when Paul came along and built his house, he really was responsible for extending Grant Street down towards the section that came out of the center, so
Right.
he played a good part there. The Bailey farm, which in the 40s was sold to the Cataldo family on Bow Street, but it was still in the 50s and into the 60s was still being actively farmed. And then I don't have a lot of history on the Boozer. You'd have to ask probably the Sun Valley Boozers, because I'm sure they're related, but the Boozer farm backed up to Bowser and Bailey's. So it was still a very, very active area.
This follows up on the fact that you talked previously about the good soil in this area and
Yeah.
everything else. So
Yeah.
here is proof of what you've said.
Yeah,
Right? You're right.
really. And we've got
And look-
pictures, of the Porter Wilson and Burnham's, Carlson's, and which, actually, that's two more. The Carlson was on the corner of Grant Street, Anna and Ted Carlson, and you really should get Eric to do a little piece with you. We've got
Right.
just an aerial view, a close-up of their property. And then up here, and I don't know, actually it isn't in this photograph, is Arthur Peterson's range, greenhouse range, that was just torn down.
Oh, yes.
Most
okay.
people in town now would know it as Plant Action or when Lexington
Right.
Gardens owned it. But it was built and operated by Arthur Peterson. And he was a carnation breeder and propagator. And he was a major part of the carnation business in the Lexington, Woburn, Tewksbury, Wilmington area. And at one time, that whole area was considered the carnation capital of the world. And it was, most of the growers were like Arthur. They had Scandinavian backgrounds. In fact, his main man, Eddie Olson, was his main grower, and again, Scandinavian. And there was a greenhouse range on the corner of Bedford and Revere Street that was owned by the Sorensens. And there's another greenhouse range that probably hardly anybody remembers, was down off of Reed Street, and I've got to find out who owned that. And then over on Concord Ave was Sam Norberg and Nish Haroyan.
Yes.
And then when you went into Woburn and Tewksbury and Wilmington, you had several Scandinavian families that were big in carnations. So Arthur, and you know, nobody gives him any thought, but he was a key part in the big floriculture picture in this greater Boston area.
Wow.
So,
Well, now we can have that memory and
Now you
preserve
know-
it,
now
right?
you know the rest of the story.
Now we know the rest. Okay, this is wonderful. All right. Now,
And
yeah.
so right there is the original section of the farm.
Okay,
And
you're
then-
talking now your own farm,
Yes.
right?
And the two greenhouses that were across there. And then at one time, this is the part that was the store recently. And at one time, I guess, is this right, Dad, that we owned all the way out to,
actually, we did.
Yeah.
Even though you can, and one thing, the road that Sam talked about, Ridge Road, was actually a county road. That's a very old road, and it crossed East Street, and,
it was the original Middlesex Turnpike.
yeah.
Okay.
And it went up and it came out up at the corner of North Street and Lowell Street. This is the house that the Doran family lived in. That's where Frost Road is now. And this is Albert and William. Albert's the father. And they grew prize-winning celery. And Albert was a state rep, I believe.
What was the last name again?
Burnham.
Oh, Burnham,
That's
okay.
Burnham. And this is a picture of part of their farm that was actually at the lower part of the hill that their house was on. But their property, as you saw in the big photograph, went all the way back to the North Street pits. So that whole Burnham Farm area, Alcott and Thoreau Road, and it was a big area. This is got a view of the Carlson.
Oh, yes.
And they were very active growers when they first came to Lexington. They had cut flower crops in the greenhouse, and they grew a lot of cut flowers outside in their field. And they produced probably at that time a majority of what they sold. And then as things changed later on, they became more dependent of, the outside sources. I'm sure you've seen these pictures of that's a typical truck. When Burnham would send 2 or 3 trucks like that to Boston. That's how big he was. And they had German prisoner of war workers during World War II that would come out and work in the fields. And the prisoners loved it. They really did. This is Oscar Kenrick's small range, and actually, when he died, he was very self-sufficient. He owned land in Concord and woodland, and he would harvest trees up there and bring them back to Lexington and make his own boards for his cold frames and celery boards, and anything that he wanted to build, he would use his own lumber. He had beehives and made all his own preserves, and this is Bill Porter and actually Matt Wilson working in actually the field, I think, that where Fisk School is now. And this is just a view of the back of their place with their 3 boiler rooms.
These are not small gardens, as people think of vegetable gardens today, and we're going to put one in our backyard and so forth, but look at the size of these, really.
That was a big place. I think John Baskin had 3 greenhouses, and there were 13 there, and I think Baskin either had 3 or 4, and then the rest were Porter and Wilson. But John Baskin married Bill Porter's daughter, May Baskin. So that was the connection.
Go back to the Great Depression era with the Dorans, or just after. That's 1944, with Ned and Bertha Doran, right in front of greenhouse number 1. This is an old catalog, the spring price list of annuals and hardy perennials from W.E. Doran and Sons. You can see it has their where they are, and it's dated 1933. The hours that they're open, and then the list of plants.
This is quite an elaborate presentation in this folder, right? I mean, this is...
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is the way they
It was
advertise.
nothing compared to Breck's. Now, the Breck Nursery that was here in Lexington was their growing range, and they had a couple of stores in Boston, and they serviced all, Brookline and Beacon Hill and Chestnut Hill and all those areas. Those people went to Breck's, and then Breck would call out to Lexington and tell them what the orders were, and they would be delivered. A lot of times the stuff would be delivered directly to these estates around Greater Boston. So Breck's really was a big place for their time, for that era.
Yes.
This is on Sheridan Street, when they were renting the house there, just before World War II. There's my grandfather on the top left. On the top right is Aunt Lena, who died about 1 year afterwards. There's Ned and Bertha and my Uncle Dick. Back to you.
Back to me?
Back to you. All right, we'll go back to you.
Well, picking up, actually, when my father came back and started building the greenhouses, he started by mostly growing cut flowers.
All right.
And he also continued building up the retail business in spring, which was key to the business. So in the first two greenhouses that they had, he would propagate and seed and grow items for the spring business. This is me probably carrying things that he had, bunches that he had cut for market. He grew shade palms, which were grown outside. They also were grown inside, but it was easy to grow them outside in the summertime. And shade palms were chrysanthemums, cut chrysanthemums, that were planted in beds and tied up to keep them straight. And he built these frames out of pipe that allowed him to cover the crop with shade cloth, black cotton cloth, and also some of them had canvas, but the cloth was lighter and easier to handle. And it allowed him to time the crop. He could have several plantings, but time them so that by shortening the day, brought the mums into flower, because they tend to flower on a short day. The chrysanthemums do. They set their bud. So he could have varieties that typically would flower in late September or October, but he could shade them and shorten their day and get them to initiate their bud and then flower late August into September. And he could grow several plantings of the same varieties, the same mix, but have them staggered so that, and control when they flowered. And that was a big crop for him. And it gave him a great beginning, it gave him a great income, and it allowed him to, it gave him an income to continue growing his business and building more greenhouses. So, and another outfit, Cummings and Woburn, were a big shade palm grower at the same time. One thing back then, everybody got along, all the businesses got along, and you could go to any competitor, so to speak, competitor, and talk about how to grow things, and everybody shared ideas, and there was enough for everybody, and everybody was friendly. It was quite a community at that time. So that was a big part of his beginning, and then as that was also hard work. My mother would have to go out if you had these beds, and these beds, he had about a half an acre that was covered with these beds of palms, and they were all covered, or a lot of them were covered. And if you got a violent thunderstorm, you'd have to go out. He'd wake my mother up at like 2 in the morning, and they'd have to go out and roll all this cloth back and canvas back. And if it had been raining, it was wet, and it was tough. And along in the early 60s, there was an ice storm that bent all the frames down.
Oh, dear.
And my mother says that was the best day of her life. That when they looked out in the morning and they saw all the frames had caved in with the ice, she said, "That's it, I'm done." So,
But she reneged on that promise, right?
no, they never rebid, because
they
by
never-
that time, the palm business had changed, and they were beginning to be shipped in from out of state, and there were more guys in it. And the greenhouse business and the retail business had grown to a certain level. But also, more importantly, in the mid-'50s, he had gotten into propagating geraniums, early '50s, actually. And that's where the bulk of the interest and effort was put. And he built up quite a wholesale geranium propagation business. And I can remember seeing the ads in Florist Exchange, which was a major, at that time, a major publication for the greenhouse business nationally. And he would advertise rooted cuttings and ship them all over the country. I can remember going down to the Railway Express in Arlington, and he was shipping by train across the country these rooted cuttings, or unrooted cuttings even. That was a nice thing about the geranium, that done in a timely fashion, you can take cuttings off the stock plants or the mother plants and pack them in damp moss and ship them, and you have several days that they're still fine. So that was where the emphasis was put, was on building a wholesale geranium business, as well as continuing to build a spring retail business. But the retail business back then was basically 30 days. That was it.
Really?
That Mother's Day it started, and by the 15th of June it was all over. People had bought all their
What they needed.
Mother's Day, Memorial Day, and garden items, and it was done by the middle of June. And so it was important to have some other crop that you had throughout the year. Some guys were pot plant growers. They would grow holiday crops like lilies and poinsettias, and that was and some were growing other types of cut flowers, like the Cups were big into snaps, and still are. They still, Jerry and his brothers have gone back to being major snap growers. But the whole business has changed, and the key to being successful was to continue to grow with it or to change directions. Here's a picture of my first farm stand.
Now that's something.
That was out of the home garden, and
Look at that.
you know, this is, I forgot to show you this. That's the Bailey Farm, which is, and this is the entrance to the Bowser Estate that divided the Bailey and the Doran Farm. And this is about a quarter-mile long. It's from East Street down over the Vine Brook, and then it took a right into the Bowser Farm and estate area. But there was a chain link fence on both sides that, and you can see the grass strip.
Yes.
And those are old variety rambling roses that they maintain, that quarter-mile on both sides, that were just absolutely beautiful. And in June, the fragrance would carry for miles. That's how well-maintained it was. And this, what we called the track road, when the fellows would get to the barns in the morning, they would hook up the sulkies, Bowser raised trotters, and they'd hook up the sulkies, and they would come up to East Street and turn around and go back out to Grant Street near Colony Road a couple of times just to warm the horses up and exercise them, and then they'd take them out for a real run on the track. So we saw the sulkies going up and down all the time, and when they put the horses either out into the paddocks or back into the barn, then they'd get a tractor and they had a piece of chain link fence, and they'd go back and forth on the track, and you wouldn't see a hoof print there by midday. They kept it so well maintained. So that brings us to when Peter, John, and Guy, Bob's boys,
Yes.
grew up and chose our direction in life.
Yes.
My oldest brother, Peter, went to the UMass and then went on to become a educator. He taught in West Virginia for a few years, and then he taught for quite a few years at North Shore Community College, as well as working a second job with the Essex Institute. John went on to have a great career with Polaroid and ended up working in a lab with a team that worked directly with Dr. Land. So he had a good career there. And I didn't do too well in school, so I had to stay home and work in the greenhouses. And had a great time.
Well, there's a science to working in the greenhouse and to have a farm. I mean, I don't understand how it takes so much work and so much knowledge. Sometimes you think, oh, it's easy, you just plant, for somebody that doesn't understand, to just drop a seed in the ground and then something will happen, hopefully.
Well, I had a good
it's
teacher.
a science. I mean, really, I'm impressed with the amount of work that goes into this and how people can do it. I mean, really, it's remarkable.
It was very interesting, and I had a good teacher. My dad, I mean, it was, I guess, in our blood. It was in his blood for sure. And he went to UMass, and so he had a formal education there and passed so much on to me.
Yes.
And when I got out of high school, the great thing about my dad was that he was always willing to listen to new ideas, and as I expressed an interest in building retail, he was very supportive, and we worked together, and he never, we looked at how we were going to do things, and he was right there, and we built more greenhouses, built a little store, and a display house connected with the store. And by then, the whole year's production was really geared towards the retail, both the spring business as well as holiday crops. We did grow lilies for a few years. We grew a lot of poinsettias. That became a main crop. And up until several years after he died, we still maintained a good wholesale geranium business. So, and then as the gardening, and it was really with the Jim Crockett and the Victory Garden, that's when a whole new generation of gardeners, and the gardening season extended basically to several months. By then, when Crockett came along, you did have a fall business with hardy mums and cabbage and kale, but it was really Jim that you built the enthusiasm and got the perennial gardening going stronger, and that extended the season. And then as that generation became more interested, then they spent more time in their yard and wanted more color all season, so that it became it doesn't stop. It starts early April,
Right.
late March, really, and goes until mid-late fall. So it's been a great advancement in gardening. As far as Doran's, I pride myself and my family on some of the things that we did probably first in the area. I don't know if it was first altogether, I'm sure it wasn't, but my dad was one of the, I was looking for that booklet,
Yes.
I can remember back in the late 50s, early 60s, he started promoting Patient Lucy's. And that was not a known annual at all. And he told me to run an ad in the Boston Herald Traveler on Sunday. And all it says is, what does it say?
It says, too much shade, try Patient Lucy.
Lucy's.
All colors, 4 packs, open daily, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m.
And that
Doran's
ad
Green.
brought people from Chestnut Hill, Beacon Hill, the Back Bay, and those were the people that, we had several people that were on the Hidden Gardens of Beacon
Yes.
Hill.
Mhm.
They would come out, and those customers and their children actually stayed with us for years and would continue coming because of, I would say because of that ad. And my father's idea of promoting Patient Lucy. And, you know, it was a tremendous, hanging baskets. Nobody really grew hanging baskets, and he found a wire basket and lined it with moss. Now, I think this is something that he had seen in, possibly in Breck's or at Frazier's. And Frazier's was a upper scale garden center back in the early part of the century, middle part of the century. And so my father started growing these moss baskets of ivy geraniums. And then that went to using plastic pots, which were less expensive and easier to handle, with snap-on hangers. And then, by then, another part of the industry, the pot industry, it was all clay pots. Everything we grew in up until, I would say, the late 50s, early 60s were in clay pots. Everything was grown in clay pots, or wooden boxes. You'd spend the winters making little wooden boxes to plant your petunias and marigolds and tomato plants in. But the clay pot business, Keller Pottery down in Cambridge, next to Dewey Almy, if you remember that.
Yes.
Which later that area became the W.R. Grace Company.
Right.
Well, Keller Pottery, you'd get these shipments of pots. The guys would come in the trucks and slide these stacks of clay pots down a wooden chute to you. But then we worked into plastic, and the Lockwood Plastic Company out in Leominster, and that was lighter weight and easier to handle. So the hanging baskets, and then we used a regular plastic pot with a snap-on hanger, and then Lockwood started developing a pot that was a hanging pot that had its wire hangers, and so that progressed to where we're at today. But the W.R. Grace Company,
On the bottom.
came to see my father and actually used our place to run tests on developing artificial soils, which ended up being Metro Mix and Ready Earth and Miracle Grow soil.
No kidding.
And this is an ad for the industry for promoting artificial soil.
Shares a growing secret. This is wonderful.
But the first tests that were done at our place, and that was great. And my father couldn't believe the difference in the performance. We prided ourselves in sterilizing and mixing a nice potting soil, and when the fellows from Grace
Came over.
ran theirs against ours, and you saw the difference. But early on, it was more expensive to buy their mix. It was a lot more convenient, and it was very uniform mix, and it was a reliable mix. And if you didn't sterilize and mix your own soil properly, you could have problems. And that one of their concepts was that you eliminated the problems and the effort. If I did it all at once, 30 days sterilizing soil, every day, did a new batch and put it into the shed. And when I switched over, stopped sterilizing soil in our potting mix, it took me approximately 6 hours to unload pallets, a year's worth of soil.
Something.
By buying it already
I know it.
bagged and done. So 30 days, 6 hours. You know,
That
big
is
difference.
something. We'll have to.
Now, you know, I can't go without,
Oh, yes, all right.
Sam would agree that in later years, the key
Yes.
person in our business.
One of
was-
the key people in your business.
Oh, no, the
All
key
right.
person was Elaine.
Look at these are lovely photographs. Look at her. This is wonderful. She really put a lot of work into it, too, didn't she?
A lot of work
She
that
did.
nobody saw, too.
Right, right.
My mother did over the years, up until Elaine took over the bookkeeping. My mother did all the bookkeeping, and that can be a full-time job.
Of course.
And Elaine not only worked in the store, helped in the greenhouses, but did all the bookwork in later years and still raised a family and always had supper on the table.
Wonderful, a remarkable wife and mother, right? This-
And friend.
Yes, yes, very much so.
And she came to the greenhouses in what year?
81. She came, I hired her to work in the store in 81, and in around October, and things were pretty well determined by December.
Well, some people do that quickly.
Sure.
That's very nice. No, she's put a lot of work, and you're very fortunate to have a wife and a mother such as Elaine to do all of this work, and it kept you fellows in line, right? She
Sure
kept
does.
you- Well, I want to thank you so much. It gives us a sense of the importance of what people have done in Lexington and made Lexington what it is. And I think that it's especially important for the newer residents of Lexington to realize that this was a farming community. I mean, sometimes we don't think of that. We think we can just go to the store, get the vegetables and get the flowers or whatever we need, and we never think beyond how did this come about without the farms. I mean,
And the East Street area, like
Oh,
I
I
said
know.
early on, was a key part. I mean,
Yes.
and not only in farming, but the transition into the greenhouse and the garden center business, which and Lexington Gardens, you know, it all played a big part of Lexington.
yes.
It really did.
And from what I can gather, you were all very friendly and cooperative and shared ideas.
Yeah, really.
I mean, a true sense of community.
It was. It really was. It spanned several generations
Yes.
between the farms too. So it was great. It really was.
Well, thank you both. This has been a very interesting program, and we will be back to you. We'll have to get back to you to identify some of these photos and so forth, but we appreciate your contribution to Lexington Remembers. Thank you.
Our pleasure.